Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to another video where we talk and review and do synopses of Warhammer books, both fantasy and 40k. Although I still have to enforce the 40k part, hopefully soon. Today I wanted to put a bit of a distance between the Empire-centric books that we've been covering recently, including Godric and Felix of course, but also Sigmar and Witch Hunter, which one might say are also Empire-centric. So I wanted to cover a different faction, so to speak, and one of the more well-known series of books in Warhammer literature is of course the Knights of Bretonnia. Of course, like with most fantasy factions, especially in Warhammer, there are multiple books about Bretonnia, as it is quite a lore-rich faction similar to the Empire. But probably as far as Warhammer literature goes, Knights of Bretonnia as a series is the meatiest and most focused of these stories. And it does feature just one main protagonist, one Callard of Garamond, but more on him a bit later. Before I get into this topic properly though, I just want to take a moment and remind everyone that if you'd like to support me, including in the making of these videos, but more importantly if you'd like to access my old YouTube content, you should check out my Patreon page. You can just join as a free member and check out the many playlists there and see if it warrants your time and support. The stuff we review here can also be found there in much longer form, if you know what I mean. All the relevant links are in the video description. And if you enjoy these review videos, you can also comment, like, subscribe and all that good stuff. Now, back to Bretonnia. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this particular series, and more particularly today, the first volume, Knight Errant, is that Bretonnia is a very different place to tell a story in Warhammer. In case you know nothing about them, Bretonnia is a mix of old King Arthur legends and mythology, the medieval French, and an over-the-top fixation with knights, codes of chivalry, damsels in distress and that kind of culture. The Bretonnians in the lore are technically one kingdom ruled by one king, but in reality they're more like a confederation of duchies, all answering to the king. 13 of them to be more precise. And each of these is ruled by, you guessed it, a duke, who has a great deal of authority over his subjects. Another thing that is inextricably tied to pretty much every novel and story featuring Bretonnians is their obsession with the code of chivalry and being the best possible knights. And this is obviously inspired by real-life culture of knights and damsels and actual codes of chivalry from the early Middle Ages. But the twist in Bretonnia is that everyone worships the entity known as the Lady of the Lake. Yes, that Lady of the Lake from Arthurian legend, who gives Merlin his sword and eventually takes it back. And this Lady of the Lake is at the core of all beliefs of the Bretonnian knights. But obviously not everything is as rosy as the Bretonnian royalty would have you believe in Bretonnia. And pretty much from the get-go you are gonna get confronted by the reality that almost all the characters in the story, or at least the knights, and there's plenty of those, are all gigantic assholes. They are all entitled, arrogant, self-righteous, and ignorant pricks of the highest caliber. Why ignorant, you may ask? Because they always believe that their way is the only right way, and nothing in the universe deserves to alter that status quo even a little bit. It is obvious that the author did want to emphasize, in probably an even more over-the-top way than it actually was in reality, how big the gap between the higher classes, in this case the knights, the dukes and the barons and whatnot, and the lower classes. And there is arguably no lower class in Bretonnia than the peasants, though there is some variation within even that group. Now, I'm not gonna detail all the instances where peasants get maltreated in these books, because we would be here for hours, but I will say that you'll probably hate about 90% of the knights characters in this story, in this whole saga that is, regardless of the fact that they are the quote-unquote good guys in the story. Anyway, enough of me ranting about peasants and Bretonnian lore. What is Knights of Bretonnia, the series, actually about? Well, for starters, to better introduce you to it, the series features 2 novels, 2 novellas, and 1 short story. Namely Knight Errant, Knight of the Realm, Rest Eternal, Questing Knight, and Grail Knight. All of it started in 2008, if this information is correct, when Knight Errant was published. So while this series isn't as old as Gotchuk and Felix, for example, it is still pretty old. And all of it is more or less the journey of the one main character, a certain Callard of Garamond, and his trials and tribulations, who fortunately isn't as big of a dick as most of the other knightly characters, but he is still a little bit of a dick. This saga is basically the story of one young knight, who has to defy the odds and prove himself worthy of being a proper knight. I'm saying defy the odds because he is followed by a bit of a curse, with his mother being considered, for lack of a more polite term, a witch. And then his father, who is a local lord, remarried and had another child called Bertolus. And the dynamic between Callard and Bertolus is one of the higher points of the story in my opinion, or at least in the first 2 volumes. Probably worth mentioning that Bertolus is a far bigger asshole than Callard. But again, this attitude was probably written on purpose by the author, to show how ignorant the nobility of Bretonnia really is, since they do consider the peasants pretty much their slaves, but with a different name. Throughout the saga, Callard will eventually become a proper knight and solve some of the mysteries about his mother and origins. Another element present in the series is the influence of the Lady of the Lake, and how Bretonnians let this idea of her influence pretty much all their policies and attitudes towards other things. I mean, just to give you an example, a knight of Bretonnia will likely impale himself on his own lance before using a ranged weapon. All that stuff is left to their men-at-arms, who are just a class slightly above peasants to them. And it amuses me to no end, especially the last time I read these and narrated them, to imagine how utterly effed up the best of the best in Bretonnia would be against anything resembling a modern army. And I'm not even talking about real-life modern militaries. I'm talking about a purely range-dedicated, like, dwarf army, for example. You know, with cannons and organ guns and units of gunpowder troops. It's just a real shame that, at least in this book series, the Bretonnian armies don't really get put in their place for their ridiculous mentality, although they do get defeated a few times. You probably noticed by now, but I'm not actually a big fan of Bretonnian knights in these books. I was actually cheering for them to be killed by beastmen later, and in the 2nd volume and the later books by chaos warriors and some other big nasties. But to move on with the theme of the saga, in a way it is the classical coming-of-age story. Callard has to prove it to both himself and those around him that he is a worthy warrior and that he deserves to be a knight. Along the way, there are tons of adversities and adversaries, including his stepmother, who would definitely fit in a Cinderella story, if you know what I mean. More traditional enemies as well, with a focus on beastmen in the first book, with the main villain actually being part of a kind of family secret / curse kind of thing. He eventually meets his sister, who is now a servant of the Lady of the Lake and the Fey Enchantress. Note, to those who aren't lore buffs, the Lady of the Lake and the Fey Enchantress in Bretonnia are not the same thing. In fact, the Lady of the Lake is one that all the knights would gladly subscribe to the OnlyFans of, while the Fey Enchantress is one that they would rather not deal with. Callard does go through a lot of grief and loss during the journey, like any classical hero. He loses the woman he loves, although not in the way you might imagine. He learns about a secret shame that taints his bloodline, and which later causes him to actually become a questing knight, after which he becomes a Grail Knight. And Grail Knights are actually a huge thing in Bretonnia, as they are the most blessed by the Lady, and they can pull off some ridiculous feats of superhuman actions. In fact, there is one Grail Knight in the story, and he makes multiple appearances, and you can see that why they all want to become Grail Knights. So, before we get into the synopsis elements of Book 1, your question probably might be, is this book or series worth reading? I would say that yes, it is. Even if for no other reason than because it is the Bretonnian book series to read. If you are more or less knowledgeable about the lore and still hate them, then this book is definitely not gonna make you like them. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just to read about them despite all their shortcomings. But that's not to say that these are, bad books or bad stories. At least the first 2 volumes are entertaining knight adventures in the grimdark world of Warhammer, and they are fun reads. If you can get over how assholish the knights are. Now, since we are going over the whole series here, I think it's worth adding that the latter 2 novellas are definitely rushed, and they should have been full novels instead. But I'm hopefully gonna get into more detail on that when I actually cover them. Next, as I've started doing the last video, let's take a deeper dive into the actual plotline of Knight Errant. Obviously there are spoilers ahead, although I'm not gonna go into every single detail and every action of every single character. In fact, I'm gonna leave a few things out just so you can enjoy them while you're reading or listening. Still, warning, some spoilers ahead. Our story begins in the fiefdom of Garamond, within the dukedom of Baston. One Callard, the rightful heir to the barony, has spent his youth trained in elite swordplay by the aging weapon master Guntar. And kudos to Guntar because he's one of the few characters in this book who isn't an asshole. Or at least he isn't really shown to be one. I mean, he's a weapon master who trains knights, and the 2 main characters, but he does have more common sense. And actually doesn't hesitate to put his charges in place when the situation demands it. Callard's home life is, however, quite dysfunctional, as his father, Lethur, even at this point early on, is said to be sick with a mysterious wasting sickness. His bitter stepmother actually plots against him, and his charismatic but reckless half-brother, Bertolus, is a constant rival for affection and status, and he's also a bigger asshole. Fortunately for everybody involved, they get informed that there is a massive greenskin army advancing upon the kingdom, and the realm of Garamond is called to fight them, alongside all the other parts of the dukedom. Seeking glory and the right to prove themselves worthy of becoming true knights of the realm, Callard and Bertolus then, along with the small army of Garamond, muster and march out. Callard and Bertolus get their first taste of war when they ambush a greenskin raiding party devastating a small village. Callard does prove himself to be a deadly combatant, but the glory of the campaign is quickly overshadowed by danger from within. Callard ends up surviving a set of highly coordinated assassination attempts, and it becomes clear that a mysterious faction is basically out to get him. The campaign against the Greenskins takes a more horrifying turn when the Bretonnians realize, after they defeat the Greenskins, that the orcs were actually running away from a much bigger threat emerging from the deep forests. A great horde of beastmen, controlled by a Bray shaman. And this puts the idealistic romantic notions of chivalry held by the young knights errant to the test, as some of their views become shattered by the terrifying savagery of chaos, and the fact that war is not as rosy and honorable and clean as they might imagine. Callard does get to fight multiple times throughout all this. He does find his long-lost sister, Anara, who is now a damsel of the lady, and which is kind of a prophetess slash seeress slash sorceress in the Bretonnian faction, so to speak. And with her to aid them, they do fight another great battle against the beastmen, and they learn that they are controlled by a Bray shaman, as they're called. But this Bray shaman is not your average Bray shaman, it is in fact part of the curse of the Garamond line, which we're gonna get to in a moment. Because he was wounded earlier fighting on behalf of Bertolus in a tourney, the weapons master Guntar actually gets killed in this battle against the beastmen. Bertolus takes it really bad because it was him that the weapons master died for to protect, and of course Callard is affected as well. But before they can grieve too much, they get to return to Castle Garamond, which was attacked and ransacked pretty much after that great battle against the Beastmen by the Beastmen who survived and ran away, if memory serves. And they return there, and Callard confronts the Bray Shaman, that was the leader and the champion of the Beastmen horde. And lo and behold, here we have probably the biggest revelation in this book. You see, back in the good old times, his father, Lefthor, had a child before Callard, and this child was basically a mutant. And because obviously mutants are a big no-no, not just in Bretonnia, but pretty much in the entirety civilized old world, he took this baby to the woods and left it there. Now, there were voices that said that he should have killed the baby, but, a father simply couldn't get that done, so he just abandoned it. And this mutant boy, ended up becoming corrupted by chaos and as a Beastman champion. And obviously, he wanted revenge upon his father, and all humans, like most Beastmen, are wont to do. So Callard fights this creature and eventually kills it, but not before the creature kills his father. So everything is well when it ends well, right? Well, not really. Because it is revealed, although I'm not entirely certain if it's in this book or the beginning of the next one, but I think it's at this one. Remember earlier when I said that his father had a mysterious illness, a wasting sickness? Well, it turns out that the poisoner, because it was poison involved, was none other than his girlfriend, to use a more modern term, one Lady Elizabeth. Lady Elizabeth wanted his father to die so that she could marry Callard and they could rule together, or at least, be together. Now, this Elizabeth wasn't actually an evil person. She was more like a naive young woman. But still, you can imagine how Callard felt. But anyway, with the Beastmen destroyed, the dust finally settles and reveals the ruin of his ancestral home. Even though they won, and Callard proved that he was a worthy Knight of the Realm, and he becomes a Knight of the Realm after this, his world and worldview is kinda completely turned upside down. His father is dead, his mentor Guntar is dead, his brother is a mess and depressed and, self-destructive. His beloved Elizabeth was revealed to be a traitor, and maybe worst of all, his family bloodline is permanently stained by the revelation that he had a chaos-tainted brother. Still, none of that will preclude him from becoming the Lord of Garamond, because he was the successor. Bertelis, consumed by survivor's guilt over Guntar's death, becomes more distant and bitter, and their relatively close relationship ends up a lot more fractured. And so, guided by Anara's counsel that he has to cleanse his spiritual stain hanging over the family name, Callard realizes that he cannot stay as a lord forever. And I believe after the second volume, although I don't remember that clearly, for which I apologize, but he does eventually give up the rule and becomes a questing knight. But more on that when we actually get to that part of the story. And that, my friends, has been what I wanted to tell you about the Knight Errant book, and some of the plot threads from the other books, probably. Please forgive me if I ranted a bit too much, but like I decided a while ago, these videos are predominantly made so that I can share my thoughts on the topic, and nobody else's. I might have also mixed some plot points from the beginning of the second book here, but I do promise that the second book also has its own villains and story progression, which I'll hopefully get to in another video. As always, I look forward to reading your thoughts on this series and book in the comments below if you'd like to share them. Is Knights of Bretonnia among your favorite Warhammer books? Why or why not? And if there are any particular books that you'd like me to review and discuss, you can go ahead and share that as well. And I'm gonna see what I can do. Thanks a lot for watching and listening until this point, and Sigmar's blessings be upon you.